Good morning, everybody. Okay, good to be back. We're continuing with our study of Tzurba B'Rabbanan, volume 20, working our way through Hilchot Shabbat. We're going to pick up today on page 121 in the books. We're onto a new topic, a new section, which is about animals on Shabbat. We've been working our way through the different melachot. Truth is, there are a number of, well, as we'll see, some of these are going to be more relevant to us on a day-to-day basis. Some of them will be less relevant. But there are a number of different melachot relating to animals, specifically on Shabbat. If you think through, before we go into the text, but you think through the list of the 39 melachot, so we know there are certain melachot very much connected to animals. For example, there is a melacha of tzeidah, melacha of trapping. There's a melacha of shchita in the Mishkan. As we know, all the melachot were learned from the Mishkan. So one of the things they would have to shech the animals in order to get their hides, which they would use for the curtains and the sides of the Mishkan, etc. So killing is going to be a melacha. So that's going to raise. We won't get to it today. That will be in the next year or maybe the one after. But that's going to raise all sorts of questions. Does that mean are you allowed to kill insects, for example, on Shabbat? What about walking? If you might walk on ants. What about killing lice? This is a very, very interesting discussion. The Gemara has the Gemara says that one is allowed to kill lice on Shabbat because they do not. There is no pruvu when it comes to there's no natural reproduction when it comes to lice. Well, we know nowadays that that is not the case anymore scientifically. Does the halacha change, etc.? So that's a fascinating discussion. We'll get onto all of those. But before we get to the melachot, and in fact the melacha of trapping, which does actually come up quite often, more often than we might think. But before we get to that, the specific melachot, we know that the idea, there's a concept of allowing one's animal to rest on Shabbat. And this would apply to an animal that one owns. Historically speaking, if we go back, certainly in the times of the Torah, and even going back a number of generations, so it wasn't so common for people to have pets. And the animals that are domesticated nowadays, they would not have, but you would have cows and goats and sheep, etc., animals that you would work, right? And we find there's a prohibition against working one's animal on Shabbat. So you look at page 121, we'll have to see later on how this relates to pets as well. Another fascinating discussion. Is an animal muktzeh? Are pets muktzeh? What would that mean as well? What about if one has a guide dog, etc.? So these are some of the topics we'll get into throughout this discussion relating to animals and Shabbat. So source number 1 on page 121, the pasuk in the Torah says, "V'yom hashvi Shabbat Hashem Elokecha." We know this pasuk because we say it in Kiddush. Lo ta'aseh kol melacha. You should not do any melacha, right? Ata bincha bitecha v'zacha v'amatcha uvehemtecha v'gelcha sheb'shalecha. So it includes all those, right? You and your family, etc., and all the people that are within your household, but also your animal. One's animal may not perform melacha on Shabbat. Pasuk that is this concept is repeated again, source number 2 in the Gemara. Sorry, not in the Gemara, in the Torah, in actually in Parashat Vayetchanan, in the 10 Commandments, right? V'yom hashvi Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha, lo taseh kol melacha. Don't do any melacha. Right? The same wording. Ata bincha v'techa v'techa v'amatcha. And now it goes a little bit more specific in terms of the animals. It says sholcha v'chamolcha v'chol behemtecha. Right, your ox, your donkey, any of your animals. So the animals may not perform melacha for you, may not perform melacha at all on Shabbat. So we'll see. We've discussed earlier there is a concept of shvitat kelim, which means my possessions, right? My possessions are allowed to do melacha, so to speak. This is what this is going to help us in terms of when it comes to automation and all sorts of things. In a later shiur, we'll discuss electronic devices and how that works on Shabbat. But in terms of the fact that if you're assuming that there were no other issues of noise, etc., and things, but let's say one's washing machine was on, or one's electricity, or one's appliances, etc., are operating by themselves on a timer on Shabbat, that itself, that's not an issue. Right? We don't say there's a prohibition of shvitat kelim. Your kelim, your possessions, your appliances do not have to be resting, so to speak, on Shabbat, but your animals do have to be resting on Shabbat. One's not allowed to. Right? What happens nowadays, and I'm sure the next question everybody's thinking about is what about our robots and our all sorts of things, machinery, etc., which is how does that work? Where does that fit in? It's also going to be a fascinating discussion. It's becoming more and more relevant. And if you're interested, come to the Scotland Resident Shabbaton. I'm sure you'll hear more about that over there.
I was thinking about
Yes.
mice.
Mice.
mice on Shabbat. If you keep the cats, specifically the birds who catching mice, does the cat have to rest from catching mice on Shabbat?
Okay, so very good question. We'll talk about mice as well because we'll talk about trapping. So your question is, when we say that the animal is not allowed to perform melacha, do we mean in the sense of melacha? Or if the animal is doing that action for its own benefit, would that be different? So we'll see that. And the short answer is yes. That would be different. One would not have to stop one's cat from trapping mice on Shabbat. But we'll see. So have a look on page 122. Source number 3, we have the Mishnah in Bava Kama. It says, Echad shor ve'echad kol be'ema, right, ule Shabbat, v'chein chayav v'of v'chayotze bein. In other words, the same is true regarding any animals, right? Whatever, whether it's an ox or any other animal or birds, etc., they were not allowed to perform malacha. Again, in the days of the Mishnah and the Gemara, it's far more common for the animals that one would have in one's home would be these kind of animals that you're using for work during the week, ox and goats, etc. But nowadays we have pets, which maybe weren't so common back then. Okay, we'll get into that as well. Now, there are two separate concepts, which may be separate concepts, may be the same concept that the Gemara talks about, that we find in the language of Chazal, when it comes to having an animal perform work on Shabbat. There's what we call shvitat behema, right? As we saw in the psukim, it talks about right v'emtecha lo taseh kol melacha, what we call shvitat behema, which means allowing one's animal to rest. And then we have the converse of that, which is what's called mechamer. Mechamer means, it's a language, the word the Gemara uses, we'll see in a moment, but that means where one would work one's animal, right? In other words, you would drive the animal, you would lead it, even perhaps by speech, causing the animal to go and work. So the Gemara here in Masechet Shabbat, the end of Masechet Shabbat, the Gemara discusses a lot of different cases relating to animals. It says here in source number 4, somebody who is driving his laden animal on Shabbat, right? Somebody who's working his animal on Shabbat, according to Rabbi Bar Chama, the first opinion brought in the Gemara, says that this is very, very serious, that the punishment for this would be the same as if one did melacha oneself. The Gemara goes through, I'm not going to read the whole Gemara now. In source number 4, it ultimately comes to the conclusion that the punishment for mechamer would not be the same as if one had performed the melacha oneself. It's got to do with different technicalities, I guess, different reasons. The Gemara goes through exactly what the punishment would be. But everybody agrees that it's going to be an isur d'oraita, a Torah prohibition, in terms of making one's animal perform work. You can see the Rambam in source number 5 at the bottom of page 123. Asur lotzi masar be'ema b'Shabbat, nema lamanya nuach sholcha v'chamocha. Right, there are other psukim as well. We didn't see all the psukim, but it says that your animal is meant to rest on Shabbat, and therefore to place a burden on the animal to make it go out and carry, that you cannot do. Echad shor v'chamo v'echad kol be'ema v'chayav v'of, whether it's an ox, a donkey, any other animal or bird. Okay. V'im hotzia ala be'ema, af al pi shu metzuveh al shvitata eino lokeh. Okay, so he says, if you had put a burden on your animal, made it carry, that is forbidden. Okay, you would not, it says the Rambam, you would not be subject to the penalty of lashes of malkot, because one of the reasons is, here we have, it's called an isur sheba miklal aseh. From the fact is that the Torah phrases this in a positive way, let your animal rest. From there we learn the converse, the negative prohibition. Okay. Over the page, we see continues, the next halacha, says the Rambam, V'alo lav mefurash b'Torah shneimar, lo ta'aseh kol melacha, אתה בנך ביתך עבדך ואמתך ואמתך, שלא יחרוש בה וכיוצא בחרישה, ונמצא לאו שניתן לאזהרת מיתת בית דין ואין לו קין עליו. Okay, again, it's another technical explanation as to why one would not be subject to the prohibition of malkot for this issue of mechamer. Now, if you have a look at source number 7 at the bottom of page 124, here's the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah. Here it's phrased differently. It says, Adam mitzuveh al shvitat behemto b'Shabbat. Okay, so we have two different, as I said, we have two different expressions, two different concepts of how we have to let our animals rest on Shabbat. By the way, it's interesting. These are concepts which are on a d'oraita level, right, as we've explained. It's a Torah prohibition. I'm careful about using that word, but it does not fit into any one of the 39 melachot. We know there is a list. The Mishnah tells us there are 39 categories of work, 39 melachot on Shabbat. Just say something which is not in the book as well, which is very interesting, which is a lot of the Torah's instructions relating to animals. So we find many mitzvot that relate to animals, right? And we have a general prohibition of what's called tsar ba'alei chayim. One is not allowed to cause unnecessary harm to animals. I say unnecessary because where it's done in a way that's going to bring about a necessary and substantial human benefit, one would be allowed to. So, for example, there's a big discussion not related to Hilchot Shabbat, but let's say new medicines that are being developed, right? You have animal experimentation. Just as an example. So one is allowed to do experiments on animals for medicines, right, where it's leading to pikuach nefesh, it's leading to substantial benefit, it's going to cause harm to the animal. One has to do it in such a way that's going to cause as little harm as possible, where the benefit's going to be as substantial as we need, right? But there would be permitted. But in general, we have a concept of tsar ba'alei chayim. Right? One is not allowed to cause harm to animals. According to most poskim, that is a Torah level prohibition. Okay? But it doesn't fit neatly into any one of the category of the 613 mitzvot. But we say tsar ba'alei chayim. There is no place in the Torah where it says lo tetzaer ba'al chayim. Right? It does not say in that language one cannot cause harm to animals. There are many different mitzvot which relate to this idea. Many mitzvot of relating to plowing and threshing and feeding one's animals before one eats oneself. Many different examples. But so some poskim say, where do we learn the idea of tsar ba'alei chayim? So some say we learn it from certain individual mitzvot. Some say the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim is a very interesting source. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says, you know where we learn the prohibition of tsar ba'alei chayim? He says we learn it from Bilam's donkey. From the fact that in the Torah, in the Chumash, where Bilam hits the donkey and he's not allowed to, he's criticized, says the Rambam, that's one place where we learn it from. Seems a very strange place to learn a halacha. But I think we've spoken about it once before. Rav Osher Weiss has an idea. I don't remember now offhand which of the poskim says it. I can't remember. One of the Rishonim or the Achronim says that tsar ba'alei chayim, the prohibition of causing pain to animals, he says it is not a positive mitzvah and it's not a negative mitzvah. Lo aseh velo lo taseh, but it is doraita. So again, I don't remember who says that offhand, but that's, I think it's one of the Achronim who writes that. So how can it be that it's a Torah instruction, but it's not a positive mitzvah and it's not a negative mitzvah? So what is it? So Rav Osher Weiss has a beautiful idea. He says we have Taryag mitzvot. We like to put everything into neat categories, but we also have a concept what's called Ratzon HaTorah. There are things that the Torah wants us to do, and it's implied, or sometimes more than implied, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu requires. It doesn't fit technically maybe into one of the categories of a specific mitzvah, but it's something that is required of us. And there are many examples of this. He brings tefillah as an example, he brings chinuch as an example, different things. But that is when it comes to tsar ba'alei chayim. So that's an interesting idea. And again over here, there are those who learn, by the way, Tzurba Lechayim, from the fact that it says you have to let your animals rest when it comes to Shabbat also. So it doesn't fit neatly into any of the 39 melachot, but we understand that there's a Torah requirement, right, and there's a Torah prohibition not to work one's animal on Shabbat, and there's a Torah requirement of Shvitat Behemto, of letting your animal rest. So now our question is this. We've seen that there is a positive idea of Shvitat Behemto, let your animal rest on Shabbat. There's a negative prohibition of mechamer, of working one's animal on Shabbat. Why do we have it phrased in two different ways? Are these the same concept? Are these different ideas? What is the relation between one and the other? So the Or Zarah in source number 8, one of the Rishonim, so he brings an interesting opinion. The opinion that he brings is that both Shvitat Behemto and mechamer both relate only to one's own animal. And therefore, if there's somebody else's animal that I caused to work or something, then I could not be liable for that. Ultimately, that is rejected. But most of the Rishonim say, no, this is going to be the difference. Right? You see the Ran in source number 9. The Ran says shvitat behemto, and listen to the words shvitat behemto. How do we translate that in English? It means the rest of his animal, right? Why then? Shvitat behemto אין כספק שאין בהמה זו שלו, אלא שלוקח. אבל מכל מקום משום מחמר יש כאן. In other words, he's talking here about a case where if you've sold your animal to a non-Jew and therefore it's not your animal, so the concept of shvita, again, shvitat behemto is more of a passive thing, means I have an obligation, I have a responsibility of making sure the animal rests, that the animal doesn't go out to work, so I have to stop it from working. Again, and we'll see what those parameters are. But if it's not my animal, right? If I'm walking out on Shabbat and I see there's an animal, there's some donkey that's carrying a load, do I have to go and take the load off the donkey because it's work? No, it's not my animal. I didn't do anything. But if I'm the one who's leading the animal and I'm doing the melacha by proxy, so to speak, right? So it doesn't matter if it's my animal or somebody else's animal. Shvitat behemto is more passive. That relates to my animal. But if it doesn't belong to me, but nonetheless, he says, Mikom makom, isum mechamer yesh kan. Dekevan deshama lekale, va'az lemechamate. Since the mechamer means since the animal hears his voice and moves because of him, ein iflesh ben behemto lebeimat chavero. There's no difference if it's my animal or somebody else's. Shlei isur zehu atzmo oseh. Because there you are performing the prohibition. There is a fascinating discussion that emerges from this as well, something else. According to this, mechamer, right, leading the animal and causing the animal to work, I could be doing how? I'm not necessarily doing any action. I'm just calling the animal. So it's by voice. So it's by speaking, I'm causing the melacha to take place. So in a later shiur, we'll get onto electrical appliances and all sorts of things. But a question that many people want to know about nowadays, and it's becoming more and more common, right? If you have Alexa or Siri or any other number of digital assistants, right? Am I allowed to, by speaking to Alexa on Shabbat, right? Am I therefore transgressing a melacha? Is that a prohibition, right? So, in general, if you have one of these devices, it's a good idea to turn it off before Shabbat anyway, because everybody knows the story that people were sitting at the Shabbos table and they were discussing, now can you use Alexa on Shabbat? And then all of a sudden you hear, how can I help you? Right? Because once you say the name, it hears, it's always listening. But whenever we have these new questions of new technology, and always the question is the difficulty, where do we find a precedent? You're not going to find anywhere in the Gemara a discussion about using robots or using modern technology, because modern technology didn't exist. So we have to go back to first principles. And we have to ask ourselves, somebody came up to me on Shabbat a couple of weeks ago and said, can you use Alexa on Shabbat? So the question is, let's break it down. The question is, is there a concept of performing melacha by speech? So one of the sources that all the poskim go to is the shiur of mechamer. By speaking, I'm causing the animal to do melacha. Is that similar? Is that not similar? Okay, it's a discussion for a different time, but that's something that emerges from here. So we see the Mishnah Berurah, source number 10. He says, even if it's not your animal, you need to be careful about driving it on Shabbat. If it's your animal, so then you've transgressed two prohibitions. It's also mechamer and also shvitat behemah. So bottom line until this point is what we've said is that there are two separate concepts. There's a concept of shvitat behemto, which means I have to allow my animal to rest. I have to not put it in a position where it's going to be performing melacha. That only applies to my own animal. But there's also an isur of mechamer, of driving, of leading the animal, causing it to do melacha, and that applies to any animal, whether it's mine, or whether it's somebody else's, or it's rented out, or whatever. Okay. Let's see Shmat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 11, who gives us a few of the practical expressions of this, how this would apply, and we'll see some of this applies to nowadays pets, etc. as well. So he says, Midinei shvitat behemtohu. What does shvitat behemah mean? שבעליה חייב לדאוג לכך שלא תצא לו לרשות הרבים ולא לקרמלית. Right? If the animal is going out and it is carrying things outside of the Eruv, you'll say, right, I hope the animal doesn't rely on the Eruv. But we're talking about an area here where there is no Eruv. The animal's going out and carrying, that's a melacha. That's going to be considered a burden. בשעה שמסע עליה, גם אם עשה כבר היה עליה מבעוד יום, okay, even if it was carrying this burden before Shabbat. So what do we mean by that? What is included in this term burden? Bichla masa, כל דבר שאינו בא לשמירתה הרגילה של גוף הבהמה. Anything that is not part of the usual protection of the animal. Right? Somebody here on Zoom has asked a question when you put a dog on a leash. Okay, we're going to get to that very, very shortly. So כל דבר שאינו בא לשמירתה הרגילה של גוף הבהמה. אבל כל שבא לשמירתה הרגילה של גוף הבהמה, anything that's part of the usual protection of the animal, הרי עולה כמלבוש לאדם, that is the equivalent of a garment for a human being, ומותר להניח לה לצאת בו, and it can go out wearing that. Okay, in the same way, we have a discussion, again, nowadays, in most of the time, we're in Jerusalem, we have an Eruv, we don't, it's not such an issue. But if a person is in an area where there is no Eruv, right, so what can you carry? You can't carry anything. So the discussion is certain types of garments could you have on you. So for example, if you're in an area where there is no Eruv and you walk out in the morning with your talit, right? So if you're wearing the talit, then it's a garment, and that's the way you could take it to shul, but you can't take it off and carry it. So what is shmira regila? So he said, Perusha, shmira letovat habehema, anything that is for the sake of protecting the animal, kagon shmira mipnei kol, protecting, which protects it from cold, or shmira mipnei kol tzar acher, v'chen shmira shelo tevrach v'te'abed, or something that stops it from running away and getting lost, shmira nikayon simla, or it's there for it to keep it clean. Okay, all these kind of things. But if you put extra something else so that the animal is not going to cause damage, for example, a muzzle on its mouth, that would not be considered. That would be considered a burden, and that it can't go out into Reshut Rabim. Look at page 127 at the top. So you have to tie a leash around its neck. So that is allowed. Just you're allowed to take the animal through the Reshut Rabim in such a way. Okay, but you're only allowed to hold that amount of the leash that is necessary to carry the animal. So if I have a dog that's on a leash, and then I have the leashes stay very long, and I have extra, more than a tefach that's extending beyond where I'm holding it, that would be a problem in Reshut Rabim. Again, if you're in an area where there's an Eruv and you're allowed to carry, so then you'd be okay. But that would be that would be a problem. In halachatet, the next paragraph says, an identification tag that is hanging from the neck of the animal, so that also is not considered shmiran, and you can't let the animal go out with that into Reshut Rabim. So lefichach, so if you have a disc that's hanging from the collar of of a dog, that should not go out into Reshut Rabim in that way. But sometimes you have an identification tag that's attached to the body of the animal. Sometimes you have this with cows and the like, right? You have a nail that's screwed into the ear with a number, etc. That is permitted. Okay. There are a number of other prohibitions that exist related to animals. Source number 12. You see the Mishnah in Masechet Beitzah says, "Eloin mishum shvut lo lochvin al gabei beima." There is a Torah, not Torah prohibition, but a rabbinic prohibition of riding on an animal on Shabbat. And the reason why the sages made such a decree, says the Gemara, you might cut off a branch, right, in order to come and to calm the animal down or whatever, and therefore one is not allowed to ride an animal on Shabbat. Shulchan Aruch, source number 13, he says, "Ein lochvin al gabei beima." You can't ride an animal, you can't hang on, you can't use the sides of the animal. Okay, and then the Ramad just there adds, you may not sit in a carriage that's driven by a non-Jew on Shabbat, because there that's considered using the animal, and that would be forbidden. All right, now, just one source I think that we skipped. If you go back and see source number 6. Source number 6, this relates to Jeremy's question. Okay, on page 124, there the Mechilta says, and the Pasuk says, "L'man yanoch shocha v'chamocha," Osif lo hakatuv, nayach echad, liot tolesh min hakarka ve'ochel. In other words, when the Torah says, why does it say, "L'man yanuach shulcha v'chamucha, saying that your animal should rest. It means it should rest in the sense that whatever's for the resting for the sake of the animal. So if the animal is plucking from the ground and eating, you asked about trapping mice, right? But the animal now plucking, we know that plucking grass would be a melacha of kotzer. So do we have to stop my cow from or sheep or whatever it is from grazing the grass because it's plucking? No, that is allowed. אתה אומר לקח בא או לא בא אלא שיחשבנו בתוך ביתו. אמרת אין זה נייח אלא צער. In other words, the animal has to rest in the sense that it's not going to cause it distress. So any sort of melacha, right, it's plucking the grass or it's eating a mouse or whatever that the animal is doing for its own sake, that's not what we're talking about. But shvitat behema means if I'm causing the animal to perform a burden, as we've discussed. Okay, so that is the concept of shvitat behema, the way it relates to, again, farm animals, domestic animals, dogs, carrying, etc. The next discussion that we have relates to a melacha, right, or the melacha of tzeidah, melacha of trapping. And I'll just say again as well, it's very, very interesting. We have these melachot, and we have discussions, and you'll say, where in my life am I going to encounter the melacha of trapping? Okay, so first of all, it's more common than you might think. A bird flies into your house, or right, there are different applications of this. Also, we'll see, is there a concept of trapping people? Right? If you lock the door, is that concept of trapping as well? We'll get to that. But so obviously, if a person want to set a trap for mice or something like that, okay, setting the trap on Shabbat, that would be prohibited. But it's important to learn once we learn the principles and the fundamentals of how this melacha of trapping works, we find that this is one of the places where the poskim learn from for many, many modern questions, which you wouldn't think initially have any connection. There's a trip I know in a number of weeks' time to Machon Somet. So it may or may not surprise you to know that when you go to Machon Somet, you'll see that a lot of the principles for how different devices and automation and all these things work on Shabbat are learned out from the parameters of Melechet Seidah. Okay, what does trapping a deer have to do with automatic lights on Shabbat? Okay, that is I'll leave that for Machon Somet. But that's actually one of the primary sources where we learn these discussions. Very interesting. I spoke about this once, and somebody told me that he used to live in rural Oregon, and he remembers that there were deer that would walk around and they would run around outside, and every time the deer would walk past, the automated lights would go on. So for him, he had this association between these two things in his head, but that's actually one of those deer were very, very well versed in Hilchot Shabbat, apparently. So anyway, but let's begin. Let's work through the principles of Melechet Seidah. Later on, we'll see how that translates into the modern applications. But the first thing we have to know is there are three questions when it comes to Tzeidah. You have a look, page 129. You have the peach box at the top with the background. It says that there are three criteria. Number one, we're going to discuss is this an animal which people often trap? Okay? If it's an animal that would normally be trapped, that's going to be a Torah prohibition, whereas if not, it would only be rabbinic. Number two is, was the animal already considered a somewhat trapped state? And number three is that what does the person's action cause the animal to do? Okay, so let's see. Yeah, the Gemara in source number 14, Gemara Masechet Shabbat says, and it's a little bit confusing because we have the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat and we have the Gemara in Masechet Beitzah, and we need to compare the two of them to see exactly how this melacha works. But source number 14 says, Tan Rabbanan, atzad chagavin, gazin, tzil'in, v'itoshin b'Shabbat, chayav divrei Rabbi Meir. First we talk about which species of animals we are talking about. Rabbi Meir says, right, locusts or hornets, mosquitoes, all different types of insects, one would be liable on a Torah prohibition for trapping them. Let's say often a lot of the times with these kind of animals, mosquitoes, etc., there's a question about trapping and there's a question about killing as well, which would be a separate malacha we'll talk about another time. Okay, so we paskin like Chachamim, not like Rabbi Meir. And this is the principle. Chachamim say, kol shebeminon itzod, meaning any animal that is typically trapped for human use, one is going to be chayav, that is going to be a Torah prohibition, and kol she'en beminon itzod, patur. Now remember, throughout Hilchot Shabbat, when we use the word patur, patur means exempt, but it means patur, we generally assume that means patur aval asur, meaning exempt from Torah, on a Torah level, but it would still be a rabbinic prohibition. Okay, so that's animals that are not generally trapped. People don't want those. Okay, says the Shulchan Aruch, source number 15. There you see it. There you see it explicitly. Therefore, flies and the like, although they are not normally trapped, nonetheless would still be forbidden. It's an isur de Rabbanan. Okay. Now the Avnei Nezer, source here number 16, has an interesting explanation. So why should it make a difference? At the end of the day, on the Torah level, right, I'm trapping the animal. Why does it make a difference? What kind of animal normally is trapped, isn't trapped, etc.? Why does that affect the definition of the melacha? And the Avnei Nezer says that Seidah is one of those, it's an unusual melacha. We find this by a number of the melachot. He says like this, Nireli, source number 16. Nireli dainu tamat davar she'en b'mino nitzod patur. Why should it be that an animal that is not typically trapped, one is going to be exempt? In other words, it's not a Torah prohibition, just rabbinic. Deshanya melechet Seidah mishar melachot. This melacha is different, melacha of Seidah is different from the other melachot. Why? Sheyesh bahen shinui b'davar shnaseh bo melacha. Generally speaking, and you will find other exceptions to this, but generally speaking, a melacha is a creative labor. It's an action which makes a change in the object, right? Let's take, you think of a melacha of bishul, for example, right? I have raw food and I cook it and it becomes cooked food. There's a qualitative difference in the food that I have. I think about writing. I had a blank piece of paper, an empty parchment, and now it has writing on it, something different. Boneh, I have a pile of bricks, which becomes a house, right? There is a change that is taking place in the object. But Seidah, he says, there's not necessarily a change that is taking place. It was an animal. It's still an animal. It's in a different place. Okay? But he says, generally speaking, יש בין שינוי בדור שנעשה מהמלאכה. אפילו הוצאה מרשות לרשות נשתנה במה שהוא ברשות אחר. So interesting that he brings an example from the מלאכה of הוצאה, because there are many Rishonim who say this is the exact problem, the מלאכה of הוצאה. Masechet Shabbat begins talking about the melacha of carrying. Everybody asks, why of all the things in the world, you begin Masechet Shabbat? If it was up to me, and I was writing Masechet Shabbat, so I would start with a list of the 39 melachot, and you would go through. That's not what the Gemara does. It begins with the melacha of hotza'ah, carrying. And the Tosfot says, carrying is, he calls it very famous, calls it a melacha grua. He says it's a bad melacha. Why is it a bad melachas? The other Rishonim explain. Because when you carry something from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim, from the private domain to the public domain, or vice versa, again, we've just explained, when you perform a melacha on Shabbat, you're changing the object. What change have you made in the object when you carry it from one place to another, or you carry it 4 amot in Reshut HaRabim? It's still the same thing. I think it's the Or Zarua, one of the Rishonim, he says, Haya chefetz v'nishal chefetz. It was whatever it was when I started off, and it still is whatever it is. Haven't made any change. Rav Hirsch in one place, I think it's in Parshat Vayakel, but Rav Hirsch in his commentary on the Chumash, so he explains, he says the melacha hotza'ah, the difference between the private domain and the public domain. So it represents social interactions, and it represents Hashem's place in history, in a sense. There's a beautiful piece over there, but that's more of a drush, I think, more of a machshavik explanation. But we're trying to define halachically what's happened here to the object. So seemingly nothing's happened to the object. So the Avnei Nezer says no. He says even with hotza'ah, so it's in a different reshut, it's in a different domain. So even that I could say is a change. I thought Seidah, but when it comes to trapping, אין שום שינוי בגוף החיה, רק אצל האדם שנעשה ברשותו. There is no change in the animal, but there is a change subjectively, perhaps from the perspective of the person who has trapped the animal. And therefore he says like this, okay, דבר שבמינו ניצוד לצורך גופו, חשיב ברשותו, שיש לו דבר מה? He says in the same way, by hotza'ah, what do I say? I say it changes from one domain to another. If there is an animal that is typically trapped, it's changed from one domain to another. It's changed from it's out there to until now, it's now in my domain. I have it. אבל דבר שאין במינו ניצוד, but something that's not going to be trapped, משום שאין בהם תועלת כלל. Why would a type of animal not be trapped? Because there's no benefit for it. So ein lo klum, af lachar shenitzod. So then, even after you have trapped it, it's still exactly the same on a Torah level. כגון הצד זבובים שאין בהם צורך. נמצא שלא חשיב ברשותו רק שמציל עצמו שלא יזיקו לו על כן הוא צדד. Right? Why would you be trapping an animal that you don't actually want? So you're sort of trapping it there in order that it's not going to harm you. Meaning you don't want to trap it for its own sake. You don't actually want it. So then we could get into the discussion of melacha she'ena tzricha legufa, and we could discuss along those lines. But he says even without getting into that, that's not that's not considered that any change has taken place objectively. נמצא שלא חשיב ברשותו, רק שמציל עצמו שלא יזיקו לו הכין וצדד, אבל לא נחשב שיש לו דבר מה. It's not that he has something, okay? לא חשיב מלאכה כלל. Therefore, it's only considered a מלאכה on a Torah level because now I have it, because now it's in my domain, because I've trapped it. That's how the Avnei Nezer explains this difference. Now, the Ritva, the last source on the page, number 17, he says, חכמים אומרים כל שמינו נצוד חייב, פירוש כגון חגבים וחגזין, all right, all different types of grasshoppers and locusts, right? It's very appetizing. Ve'af al gav de chagazin chagav tamei. So there's a type of locust or grasshopper which is not kosher. It says these would also be considered a type that should be nitzad mikol makom nechalim hem legoyim, because non-Jews would still eat them, so therefore they are considered. It's considered that people trap them, meaning that the definition here of animals that are typically trapped by people is not limited to Jews. Okay, so that's criteria number one in terms of defining the melacha biblically of what type of animal. Now the big question is, when is the animal going to be considered trapped, right? If it's in a small room, if it's in a room like this, would it be considered trapped? Does it have to be in a smaller enclosure, a larger enclosure? That's obviously going to depend on the type of animal as well. So here we see the Mishnah in source number 18. Okay, Mishnah Masechet Shabbat says like this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Hatzad Sipor Lamigdal, Utzvi Labayit Chayav. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda says, if someone traps a bird in a closet, Migdal, in modern Hebrew means a tower. Yeah, it doesn't mean necessarily a tower, but it's a sort of a closet, okay, or a cage, or a deer inside a house. The house is obviously bigger than the Migdal, but that's when you would be Chayav. Chachamim omrim, ציפור למגדל, וצבי לגינה ולחצר ולביברין חייב. Okay, so the Chachamim say that when it comes to the deer, even if it's in a courtyard, you would still be חייב. רבי שמעון בן גמליאל אומר, לא כל הביברין שווים, זה הכלל מחוסר צידה פטור, שאינו מחוסר צידה חייב. Okay, at the end of the day, there's a bit of a contradiction here between the Gemara brings between the Gemara in Shabbat and the Gemara in Beitzah, and exactly how we define it. I'm not going to get into the technicalities now, but the main idea, what emerges from the sugya, is this principle: Ze haklal, mechusar tzeda patur, sheino mechusar tzeda chayav. In other words, something which is lacking trapping. In other words, if I still can't access the animal easily, even if it's in a small area, but I'm still going to have to go and chase after it in order to trap it, so therefore then I consider the animal's not yet trapped. But if I can reach it easily, then that's what's considered trapping. That's what it means. How do we define that? If you have a look over the page, source number 20. Here the Gemara Masechet Beitzah. Okay, so it says, Heichi dami mechusar tzeda. What does mechusar tzeda mean? Amar Yosef Amar Rav Yehuda Mushmal, Kol shomer have metzuda v'netzudena. Right? If you still have to say, let's bring a trap so that we can trap it, okay, then it's not yet considered trapped. In other words, if I have a small office and a deer runs into my office and I close the door and the deer is there's nowhere for it to escape, I can get it very easily, then the deer is now considered trapped. But a mouse, right, hypothetically, that would run into such an office, and then how would I get... It's much smaller, and it would run away from me. I'd still need a trap to go and trap it. So then the mouse is not considered trapped. Okay, so source number 22, and the same thing with a bird, right? Source number 22, Shulchan Aruch, Hatzat tzipor dror למגדל שניצוד בו, ושאר ציפורים, וצבי לבית או לביבר שהם ניצודים בו, חייב. Right, if you enclose different types of bird or a deer into an area in which it is trapped, okay, the language sounds a little bit superfluous, but you understand what we're saying, then one would be liable. But if it's not trapped there, then that would be patur. Again, rabbinically, if I'm putting the animal into an enclosure that it can't get out, that's still going to be an isur d'Rabbanan of tzeidah, even if it still requires a little bit of effort to be able to get the animal. So let's just see the summary of that in source number 25. Again, today we just look at the principles, but next week we'll see some more of the practical applications of this. If you have a look on page 136, a number of different circumstances: domesticated animals, dangerous animals, biting insects, animals which move slowly, protecting oneself from the cold, closing a door that was open. Okay, so we'll get onto that discussion next week. But for today, let's just see the conclusion over here of the principles. So source number 25, we're on page 133. This is the Orchot Shabbat, right? One of the contemporary works on Orchot Shabbat. He says like this: if I bring an animal into a closed area, sometimes that will be an isur d'oraita, sometimes that will be an isur d'Rabbanan. The place is small enough. Obviously, this is going to depend on the size of the area and the size of the animal. If it's small enough that if I would enter, I would be able to catch the animal beritza achat, right, with one run, without having to stop and rest, and I don't need to use a trap, so that would be an isur Torah. But if the place is bigger or the animal is smaller, that if I'm running after it in one go, I won't be able to catch it, I'm going to have to stop and rest, or I'm going to have to bring a trap. So in such a case, that would not be an isur Torah, that would therefore be an isur d'Rabbanan. Okay, and over the page you see chet. He says, Baal chayim hanimtza b'makom shebo mugdal kenitzod. If an animal is in a place where it's already considered trapped, so then mutar lachniso letoch klov hanimtza b'oto makom. So the animal's right, I'm going to be able to reach it in one sprint. It's in a small area, and now I want to put it in an even smaller area, put it in a cage. Since the animal's already trapped, that's not considered a prohibition. That was considered already trapped before the cage. We'll see, and just the last source for today, source number 26, Chuchani Rav Karelitz. Right, so he says, Tanan, זה הכלל מחוסר צידה פטור, מובהר שאף כשאינו צד למקום שיש בו חיוב צידה מן התורה, כגון שהמקום מחוסר צידה, מקום אסור מדרבנן. So we spoke about the fact that if it's in an enclosed area, that would still be a rabbinic prohibition. So he says, okay, ציפור דרור שנכנס לבית דרך הפתח או החלון. So if you have a bird that enters your house through the door, through the window, the bird is not considered trapped, because if anybody who's ever had a bird that's flown in the window knows, it's not so easy to get it and get it out. Nonetheless, still closing the door would be a problem, at least on a Rabbanan level. So he says, so how far does this go when we say an enclosed area? What does that mean? Right, if you have a walled city, so the city is enclosed, right, but the deer comes in, the place is still so big, to say that that's already an isur d'Rabbanan, that sounds very strange. So he says, what's the measurement? He says, נראה שהשיעור כשמכניס את בעל החיים למקום שיש הרגשה שהבעל חיים נמצא בשליטתו. So, okay, it's a little bit difficult to give an exact measure on it, but he says if it seems like it's under your control, so to speak. The bird's in your house. Okay, you can't catch it so easily, but nonetheless, it's within your house. Right? That would be a problem. Then that would be Nisud Rabbanan, even though it's not actually trapped. Okay, so just to summarize, we discussed today, we started talking about the different malachot, or the different prohibitions and concepts of Shabbat relating to animals. We spoke first about Shvitat Be'emto and Mechamer. I have I'd call it maybe a passive, but a positive obligation to allow one's animal to rest. That would apply to one's own animals, right? And one cannot therefore let one's animal go out with a burden, go out into Reshut Harabim. We saw this is more common when you have sort of work animals, but would apply to pets as well. If I'm in an area without an Eruv, we spoke about different cases of collars and different tags and things that are on the dogs, right? Then we spoke about Mechamer as well, which is the prohibition of leading an animal and causing the animal to do malacha oneself. That would apply to one's own animal. That would apply to anybody else's animal as well. If the animal is just doing a malacha for its own benefit, right, like eating, etc., that's not something I have to worry about. And then we spoke about the malacha of tzeidah, the malacha of trapping, and we saw essentially two fundamental principles. Number one, that it's a Torah level prohibition on an animal that is typically trapped. Number two, that what is considered trapped. It's not just that it's enclosed, but it's in an area where I'm going to be able to reach the animal very easily, right? I don't need to bring a trap, and I don't need to run around too much to get it. Okay. And based on that, from there, we'll discuss some more of the practical applications relating to trapping and setting a trap. What if you set the trap on Erev Shabbat? Okay, and you know that the animal is going to be trapped on Shabbat. Would that be a prohibition or not? Okay, so that we'll discuss next week as well. And from there, we'll go on to the other malachot in terms of killing animals, lice, other types of pests, and moving animals, feeding animals, etc. Okay, so thank you everybody for coming. We will continue next week with Radha Hashem. On